You're playing volleyball with friends or just watching TV, your nervous system is always operating, making sure that the right organs function at the right time. The nervous system is structurally divided into two regions, called the central nervous system, or CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. The peripheral nervous system can be further subdivided functionally into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Okay, let's start with the somatic nervous system, which describes a set of nerve fibers that control voluntary actions and convey sensory information from the skin, skeletal muscles, and joints. Somatic sensory fibers allow transmission of sensory information such as touch, pain, temperature, and proprioception. For example, somatic sensory fibers inform our CNS that our cup of coffee is too hot. Then, there are somatic motor fibers, which only innervate skeletal muscle and control voluntary actions of the body, like putting the coffee cup back on the table until it cools down. On the flip side, the autonomic nervous system controls the involuntary activities within the body. This system consists of visceral motor fibers that carry motor signals to smooth muscle, such as that found in the intestinal walls that allow for peristalsis to occur, as well as cardiac muscle and glandular tissue. We also have visceral sensory fibers, which are not typically defined as part of the autonomic nervous system, but they act in conjunction with the visceral motor fibers of the autonomic nervous system to control visceral function. Visceral sensory fibers travel with the visceral motor fibers, carrying sensory information from the viscera back to the CNS, where the visceral motor fibers will act in response to this sensory information. For example, they provide information about things such as the amount of oxygen in your blood, your arterial blood pressure, and the level of distension of your stomach after that big meal. This visceral sensory information is continuously regulating the activity of the visceral motor neurons of the autonomic nervous system, even while you sit here and watch this osmosis video. Now, there is also a unique set of sensory neurons we want to mention called special sensory fibers, which relay sensory information related to our special senses, such as smell, sight, taste, hearing, and balance, back to the CNS for interpretation. These fibers are not really classified as part of the somatic or autonomic nervous system. However, this information can modulate the activity of the somatic motor system, such as sending signals to skeletal muscles to turn your head in response to a sound. Or the autonomic nervous system, such as stimulating salivary glands in response to the smell of a freshly baked apple pie. Okay, now let's dive a bit more into the autonomic nervous system, or ANS. The ANS has two major subdivisions, the sympathetic nervous system, or SNS, and the parasympathetic nervous system, or PSNS. In addition, some classify the enteric nervous system, which is the intrinsic nervous system of the GI tract, as the third subdivision of the ANS. Now, let's start by discussing the SNS and PSNS, which, for the most part, have opposite effects in the body. Alright, now you've probably heard about the fight or flight response, which kicks in when one encounters an alarming situation, like seeing a bear on your hike, or before taking an exam. These situations activate the SNS, which prepares the body to respond to extreme or stressful situations. For example, the sympathetic nervous system will cause dilation of the pupils to improve vision, increased heart rate and blood pressure, and diversion of blood flow to the organs that will help with our fight or flight response, like skeletal muscles and the brain. On the flip side, organs that are not urgently needed to address the immediate stressful situation, like the kidneys and the gastrointestinal tract, are toned down. Okay, so once that bear is gone, or the exam is over, the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in to calm things down. It does so by decreasing your heart rate and blood pressure, increasing gut motility and digestive secretions, and by allowing blood to flow back to the organ systems that have been put on hold by the sympathetic nervous system, like the digestive system. These effects can be summarized as the body's rest and digest response. In a nutshell, you can think of these two divisions of the ANS like a seesaw, where they work together to balance each other out. Alright, as a quick break, let's see if you can answer the following questions. What are the main divisions of the peripheral nervous system? How about the different components of the autonomic nervous system? Okay, now let's discuss how information from the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems communicate through the central nervous system. Remember that a group of cell bodies in the central nervous system is called a nucleus, while a group of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system is called a ganglion. Now, information that's conveyed in the autonomic nervous system passes from the CNS to its target organ through a two-neuron system. The first neuron sending a signal from the central nervous system is called a preganglionic or presynaptic neuron, and the second neuron that the preganglionic neuron synapses with is called a postganglionic or postsynaptic neuron. This second neuron is usually the effector neuron, meaning that it then directly synapses on the organ that it acts on. Now, there are other differences between the sympathetic or parasympathetic divisions of the ANS, based on the locations of the preganglionic neuron cell bodies and the route that the pre- and postganglionic neurons take to reach their effector organs. Let's start by talking about the neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. So, the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic division are located in the intermediolateral nuclei, which make up the lateral horns of the spinal cord's gray matter in the thoracolumbar spinal cord segments. Specifically, the preganglionic neurons arise from the T1 to L3 spinal cord segments. Now, let's follow the path of the preganglionic neurons more closely. So, from the intermediolateral nucleus, all of the preganglionic sympathetic fibers exit the spinal cord via the anterior root and enter the anterior rami of spinal nerves T1 to L3. Shortly after, these fibers leave the anterior rami to enter the sympathetic chain via the white rami communicantes. The sympathetic chain, or trunk, is a paired structure that runs parallel on either side of the spinal cord, and it resembles an interconnected string of pearls. The sympathetic chain consists of a bundle of nerve fibers and neuron cell bodies. The neuron cell bodies within the sympathetic chain form the paravertebral ganglia. Now, when the preganglionic fibers enter the sympathetic chain, there are four possible routes for these fibers to take to synapse with their postganglionic counterparts. First, a preganglionic fiber can enter and immediately synapse with the postganglionic cell body in the paravertebral ganglion at its respective vertebral level. Second, it can also pass through the paravertebral ganglion to ascend, or third, to descend the sympathetic chain before synapsing at a paravertebral ganglia at another vertebral level. Fourth, and finally, the preganglionic fibers can pass through the paravertebral ganglia without synapsing, and instead, they continue via splanchnic nerves to one of a number of prevertebral ganglia located anterior to the aorta and synapse there. These ganglia are named according to the main aortic branch that they're positioned near. The most superior are the paired celiac ganglia, found around the celiac trunk. Just below are one or more superior mesenteric ganglia, followed by the inferior mesenteric ganglion. For preganglionic fibers that synapse in one of the paravertebral ganglia, their respective postganglionic fibers then enter the gray rami communicantes and re-enter and travel along spinal nerves towards their target organs. If they just pass through the sympathetic chain without synapsing, they continue to the prevertebral ganglia, where they synapse on postganglionic fibers that innervate their target organs. Now, since the majority of the preganglionic fibers of the SNS synapse within the sympathetic chain, they're relatively short, while the postganglionic fibers are longer, traveling all of the way from the sympathetic chain to target organs all over the body. Alright, now let's move on to the parasympathetic nervous system. This division is known as the craniosacral division, since the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons can be found in the gray matter of the brainstem and the sacral region of the spinal cord. The fibers arising from the brainstem leave the CNS through cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, and they innervate the head, as well as the organs found in the thorax and abdomen. The fibers arising from the sacral region of the spinal cord exit through spinal nerves S2 to S4 to innervate the pelvic viscera, and some abdominal structures as well. Now, in contrast to the sympathetic division, the parasympathetic preganglionic fibers are very long, because they typically synapse in ganglia that are much closer to the target organs, and this means the postganglionic fibers are quite short. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the enteric nervous system is sometimes considered a third subdivision of the autonomic nervous system. The enteric nervous system is a semi-autonomous system of neurons that make up the majority of two nerve plexuses within the wall of the GI tract. The submucosal, or Meissner's plexus, which is located within the submucosa, and the myenteric, or Auerbach's plexus, which is found between the circular and longitudinal layers of the muscularis externa. Given these locations, it makes sense that the submucosal plexus is involved with regulating local secretion and absorption of the nearby mucosa. On the other hand, the myenteric plexus, being located within the muscularis externa, is more involved in regulating the tone of the gut wall and the intensity of contractions. Now, the enteric nervous system is nicknamed the gut brain because these nerve plexuses can actually act completely on their own, as they possess receptors, sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons, allowing for intrinsic reflexes to regulate GI function without any input from the CNS. For example, if stretch receptors in the stomach are activated by distension caused by a big meal, neurons within the wall of the stomach will directly activate smooth muscle fibers to increase motility, which will help digest that delicious veggie burger. Even though the enteric nervous system can act independently, though, it is still heavily influenced by the CNS, with the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems modulating the activity of the enteric nervous system. In the parasympathetic rest and digest response, the PSNS will interact with the enteric nervous system to mainly stimulate the activities of the digestive system, as opposed to the sympathetic fight or flight response, where the SNS will act to inhibit the activities of the digestive system. Okay, so before the recap, feel free to pause the video and see if you can identify the structures of the sympathetic nervous system. Alright, as a quick recap, the peripheral nervous system is functionally divided into the somatic nervous system, which consists of somatic sensory fibers as well as somatic motor fibers that control voluntary actions, and the autonomic nervous system, which is composed of fibers controlling involuntary functions of our body. The autonomic nervous system consists of visceral motor fibers that innervate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, and are accompanied by visceral sensory fibers that help regulate the function of the viscera. The autonomic nervous system is further divided into the sympathetic division in charge of the fight or flight response and its balancing counterpart, the parasympathetic division in charge of the rest and digest response. The preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system leave the CNS from the thoracic and lumbar spinal segments and synapse relatively close to the spine in paravertebral or prevertebral ganglia, meaning that their postganglionic neurons are quite long, running until they reach their target organs. The preganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, leave the CNS from the brainstem and sacral spinal segments and synapse far away, closer to their target organs, meaning they typically consist of a long preganglionic neuron and a short postganglionic neuron. Finally, the enteric nervous system can also be considered part of the autonomic nervous system. It consists of the submucosal and myenteric plexuses within the wall of the GI tract. It can act independently of the CNS, but is also modulated by input from the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems.